Hello, everyone. We welcome our tonight's speaker, Dr. Paul Anderson. Dr. Anderson is a lecturer of Persian literature at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University, where he received his PhD in 2021. He obtained his master's in Arabic literature and Islamic studies from the American University in Cairo in 2013, where he has spent 5 years conducting research on classical Islamic philosophy and Arabic linguistics. He specializes in Shi'i intellectual history with specific areas of interest focusing on Persian, Arabic, Urdu, and Gujarati literature, historical linguistics, and Islamic philosophy. His PhD dissertation, which will be the topic of his lecture tonight, is titled The Deluge of Tears, and it recently won the Foundation of Iranian Studies in 2020-2021 Best PhD Dissertation of the Year Award. So we will welcome Dr. Paul Anderson for his talk titled The Deluge of Tears, the Conflux of Persian Shi'i Literature, Ritual, and Identity in Martyrdom Narratives. As I can say it in Persian, طوفان اشکها، تلاقی ادبیات، مناسک و هویت شیعی ایرانی در روایتهای شهادت یا در مقاتل. It should be a talk about the 15th century poet and a scholar named Ḥoseyn Kāshefī, and his famous book, Rowz ol-Shohadā, that we still talk about. Rowz comes from that. It's a 5 centuries old kind of ritual around the part of that around this book. So لطفاً بفرمایید.
Okay, thank you very much for that kind introduction. So before I start, I want to give like a little bit of background as to why I decided to work on this topic, sort of what were the ideas going through my head as I was doing my research on it. Which sort of underlines, I believe, one of the central points that I tried to get to in my dissertation, which is that taziyah and maqtal and mourning over Hosseyn's death, it's all profoundly about emotion. This is a topic that sometimes scholars in my field will feel a little bit of discomfort with, because how do you quantify emotion? How do you address it? How do you bring your emotional reaction to the topic into your research without becoming too biased or entrenched in the research until it becomes to reflect you a little bit too much? But in this case, I believe that since emotion is so foundational to the rituals, to the texts, to the commemoration of Ashura in general, I believe it was an important factor to consider. So this particular topic had been in my mind as my dissertation topic for over a decade. I first started doing initial research on it while I was living in Egypt, something that many of my Egyptian colleagues were a little bit confused by. For many of them, Ashura was just a time that you would eat pudding, essentially. So a lot of them were very confused by the kind of mourning that goes on, particularly in Iran during Ashura. So a lot of my interest in this was also piqued by my background growing up. I grew up Catholic, and we also have very involved practices during Holy Week, mourning over the death of Jesus and so on. And so this was a thread, an emotional thread that I could identify with. Not so much in terms of the topic itself, but in terms of the raw emotion which is conjured when people mourn during Ashura. This particularly came to a head in 2018. I went to India, to Lucknow, to study Urdu. And while I was there, I got a chance to see many of the sites there which are used for commemoration of Ashura during the beginning of Muharram. Ashura is a big deal in Lucknow. It's probably one of the cities in South Asia that has among the most elaborate rituals that accompany the commemorations. And because of that, there are many Hoseiniyas and gathering spots in Rowz that are scattered throughout the city. So I got to see many of the tazia that were being constructed there. And in South Asian Shi'ism, tazia is like kind of a parade float that is used during Ashura processions, as opposed to it's different meaning in Iran. And I saw many of the what we might translate as cenotaphs, tabut in Urdu and in Persian. And I saw people weeping and mourning over these tombs. And I found it very affecting on many different levels. And this influenced me under the guidance of a local Marsiya Khan in Lucknow to compose a Marsiya in Urdu, in classical Urdu. And this sort of helped me focus my efforts in terms of the feeling of the poetry, the feeling of the text, to focus everything and to move forward in a tone that was both respectful as well as academically valid. And what you're going to see tonight is sort of a snapshot of what my research concluded. So I hope you find it interesting, enlightening. Yes. And as just a very quick side note, the translation that Haydar provided, Tufan e اشکها, is very close to actually the title of the Marsiya that I composed. So I thought that was an interesting coincidence. All right, some central ideas about the dissertation, i.e. what exactly was I writing about? What was my arguments? Basically, the dissertation has a central concern, which is the idea of collective memory as articulated in ritual and in literature, and how they contribute to transfiguring a historical person into a legendary one. My argument is essentially that literature and ritual, particularly in the case of Ashura, are very intimately connected, and they continually inform and reinforce each other to the point that what you see in a ritual is often either a transposition or replication or a translation of what you might see in a source text, in this case, the Rowz or the ol-Shohadā. For this central theme, there are three more specific arguments. Number one, that Kamal ad-Din Ḥoseyn Kāshefī's landmark Persian martyrdom text, maqtals, the Rowz ol-Shohadā, while hardly the only text to attribute superhuman status to Ḥoseyn, specifically transforms Ḥoseyn into an epic martyred hero, and in doing so is one of the most important texts in Shi'i history for understanding modern Twelver Shi'i belief, particularly in its Iranian Twelver incarnation. This day, as I think many people are aware, nowadays Iran still continues, and has for quite a while, continues to exercise a lot of influence on the way that that Ashura is performed throughout different Shi'i communities, Twelver Shi'i communities throughout the world, whether that be in Lebanon or in South Asia. And so because of this, this text, which I argue essentially invented many of the prototypes for what is now Ta'ziyeh, for Ashura commemorations, Marasim Ashura. It has a central and really, unfortunately, neglected place in studying Ashura ritual. Number two, that the Rowz makes use of the Arabic origins of the genre, which is to say the maqtal genre, while infusing it with Persian linguistic markers, literary themes, imagery, and archetypes, which translate the Ḥoseyn Karbala narrative from its Arabic origin to one which is suitable for Persian speakers. This is to say that the text is engaged in a process that we might call not just translation of sources from earlier maqtal literature in Arabic, but also in a process of localization. As we all know, the articulations of Islam, whether they be Sunnism or Shi'ism, will vary from place to place, and what might be the everyday ritual accompaniments to the central rituals like Salah can vary in how they are articulated. And so in order to make it suitable for a Persian audience, it needed to be localized in terms that would be appealing to this audience. Here, it's worth noting that Kāshefī was a preacher. This was one of his main engagements in his everyday life. This is where the title Vā'iz comes from Arabic wa'iz, which means someone who preaches, someone who calls or warns or gathers people together in order to deliver sermons. And Kāshefī used to go down to the marketplace and preach. He used to preach in local mosques. In some cases, in one text that details his life, we have something like a schedule of what he used to do weekly in terms of his preaching schedule. He equally preached to the common people as well as to the ruler of Herat, Beqara. So because of that, we find, like, I would say, an equal ability to move within these two spaces, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Number three, that the Rowz did not simply remain a popular book, but was instrumentalized and officially promoted by the Safavid dynasty into a ritual complex, eventually evolving into Ta'ziyeh, which served both to bolster their legitimacy as well as create a consensus of the Safavid Empire as simultaneously Twelver Shiʿi and a Persian state. A term that you'll probably hear me use is propaganda, and I want to be clear that I'm using it in an academic sense as opposed to the way that it's often shown in the media, which is a very negative sense. In this case, when I say propaganda, I mean essentially any material which is used by an authority, usually a government, in order to transmit a specific ideological message, which is something that supports their ideological goals. So that's what I mean when I use the term propaganda in connection to the Safavid state. So all in all, what I'm getting at here in this dissertation in my research is that for Twelver Shiʿism, particularly after the popularity of this text in Iran and throughout Central Asia, because as we should be aware, Herat is actually in what is now modern-day Afghanistan, but it was part of the Persianate cultural complex during this period. Thus, Ḥoseyn is the hero martyr par excellence and a template for Shi'i identity, as per Kāshefī. However, the construction of this hero martyr complex in the person of Ḥoseyn requires the investment of specific modes of popular sentiment. It is not enough to say that Ḥoseyn is a hero and a martyr. He must be shown to evoke the archetypes that enable the community to believe this is true, not merely abstractly, but in their everyday lives. To say that the narrative of Ḥoseyn makes use of memory relics, which is my central sort of theoretical contribution along with the practical contributions here, it means that the community collectively remembers the legacy of investments of form, function, and meaning and identifies them in Ḥoseyn. Okay, a little bit about what my methodology is to give you an idea of what the theory is behind this. So the central methodology is my original concept of memory relics, which draws from three main disciplines: linguistics, sociology, and history of religions. So a memory relic is a theoretical concept. It proposes that a given cultural artifact, so anything which is valued as a cultural signifier by a given group, that's a cultural artifact, is composed of three layers of operation which continuously interact during the ongoing process of meaning making. These levels are not hierarchical, they're not chronological, which means that they're not ranked in terms of relative importance or by time, like that is to say when each process goes on. They all operate at the same time. Whenever a collective cultural group uses a cultural artifact, whether it's tangible, as in, like, let's say, a tabut, or a costume during taziyah, dramatic performances in Iran, or an abstract one, and invest some value in it, they are drawing on a memory relic. However, a memory relic needs to make use of inherited artifacts. They must have an extension in time. That is to say that there needs to be some kind of a history behind the cultural artifact. It can't be just sort of spontaneously created. It has to draw on meaningful collective memory for a given group. So these three layers that I previously mentioned are in order of external presentation. That is how they would appear to us, how we sort of analyze them. Our form or mode. This is how the given artifact manifests in its practical sense, i.e. the form of a particular ritual. So for example, in Rowz, this would be the actual recitation of a given text. The function or mission, which is the way that the cultural artifact operates within the social, political, and religious milieu, that is to say how it practically works, or what it is intended to do for the community. And its meaning or force. This is to say the particular values that the cultural artifact encapsulates. The why of its usage. Why is it important to a given group? So in order for a memory relic to operate, there needs to be memory contact, which occurs through a person or a point of contact, a place of contact, and a substratum for contact. So this is my way of explaining sort of tangibly and clearly how memory relics are actually transmitted through a community. So the point of contact is whatever idea or entity or figure is being introduced into a community, and then the place of contact is is that community vocabulary, is that that sense of everyday usage. The substratum is where the memory relics reside, so the collective consciousness of a given community. So we can take the example of a loan word, and as you recall, I mentioned that linguistics is incredibly important methodological guideline for my research. As an example, this is to say, for example, the Arabic word insan. All right, this is a very common borrowing in many Iranian South Asian languages. So here it is a point of contact. It is the entity being introduced. The community could be Middle Persian speakers beginning in the Arab conquest of the 7th century. And then the particular substratum is the process that goes on wherein a term, the equivalent Middle Persian term Martyrdom zadag, is matched up with insan and gradually replaced, right? So the theory of memory relics is intended to replace the theoretical construct of syncretism. And this is for 3 central reasons. Number one, it's to get rid of sort of the historical baggage of the term. The term was largely used by Europeans, by white European Protestants, in order to basically create a framework that they could understand the contrast between the sort of this textual form of a given religion, whether that be Islam, Hinduism, or whatever, and understand why so-called divergences or some other unpleasant terms that were used show up in the everyday, day-to-day usage of an actual population. This has been used in the service of imperialist discourses on other people's religions, and as I said, usually from a Protestant European perspective. The other concerns are more sort of methodological. Syncretism tends to suggest a static state. I would instead suggest that we can call these syncretic phenomenon, and that they are not states at all, rather that they are ongoing processes. They must be active. They are not singular. They don't just occur at one point and then, you know, that's just the way it is, set in stone for all eternity, but rather they depend on time, place, popularity, and a number of other variables. So this is to say that there are no mixed religions. This is a term that you often hear in theoretical Western literature that talks about syncretism, mixed religion, but rather that there are cultural religious acts or moments when originally imported traditions are manifested in the symbolic language of the host culture they are imported into, subconsciously drawn from collective memory. So memory relics provide an avenue to explain this transmission, as I've showed previously, which syncretism fails to do satisfactorily. It just says that basically a dominant and subordinate culture come into contact, they mix, one borrows from the other, and then you get syncretism. It doesn't actually explain how this process comes about. Memory relics, on the other hand, demonstrate the evolution of syncretic processes through an interconnected levels. Right, a little bit on the background. Hold on one second, I think I might have skipped a slide. Yes. Right, a bit of background. I'm sure that this topic needs no introduction to this given audience, but for the sake of completion, let's go through it quickly. So Ḥoseyn, of course, was the son of ʿAlī bin Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin. Prophet's cousin, and of Muhammad's daughter, Fatima. He occupies a place of central importance in Twelver Shi'ism, along with Ismaili Shi'ism. In particular, though, Ashura practices tend to be more traditionally used in Twelver Shi'ism. When the first Umayyad Caliph, Muawiyah, died in 680, his son Yazid was nominated by the authorities, by the Umayyads, as the next caliph. This move was opposed by many in the Muslim community. Resistance was particularly strong in Kufa, in Iraq, what is modern-day Iraq. Ḥoseyn tried to avoid controversy at first. He also avoided ceding his claim to Yazid. Instead, he sent letters back and forth, often through intermediaries, and attempted to talk with the Kufan leadership. Eventually, when things started to get really bad, he started traveling towards Kufa, where many Kufans supposedly had pledged their support. However, while he was in process of traveling, Yazid sent an army headed by Ibn Ziyad, which was joined by the Umayyad appointed governor of Kufa, Ibn Sa'd. The battle was met at Karbala, where Hussein's caravan was denied access systematically to food and water before the battle began. Hussein's entire force was slaughtered. He was beheaded. His head was taken back to Syria, along with the women of his family and children who were enslaved. There is a very well-known story where his youngest son, ʿAlī al-Asghar, was killed in his arms by an arrow that was sent towards him. So not even all of his children survived the battle. Right, and a little bit about the names. What do they mean? What are these terms? So Muharram is, of course, the first month of the Islamic Hijri lunar calendar. It is Arabic for sacrosanct or holy, supposedly for the reason that this was a month that even before the coming of Islam, where any kind of fighting was prohibited. Ashura is in origin an Arabicized form of an Aramaic or Hebrew word, asur, which is a period of 10 days. It was probably borrowed through the medium of Aramaic, possibly Syriac. And here it also comes to mean basically a period of 10 days. Ta'ziyah in Arabic is the verbal noun of form 2 or fa'ala of the Arabic root aziya, ya'za, which originally meant to be patient or to endure. The form is causative, so azza means he made patient, which came to mean he consoled. And this forms of this word are still used in the Arab world for non-specific religious meaning. So if in Egypt, for example, if you go to someone's Azza, it's sort of like their funeral service. You're going to give condolences to the family. So this word has a very long history of being associated with funeral commemorations. However, these terms may be used differently depending on region and language. In Arabic, ta'ziyah was less used specifically in reference to Ashura rituals until the rise of the Persian use of the term after the 16th century. Other terms that we hear used, which were more common, were terms such as maqtam, a funeral service, or al-majalis al-Husayniyya, basically like sessions for Hussein. In Iran, Ta'ziyah is a very specific ritualized mourning ceremony, which has also evolved into a kind of passion play. So you will see things like Ta'ziyah names, which are essentially scripts to be used for the performance of these passion plays. In South Asia, as I previously mentioned, a taziyah is a kind of a parade float. These are floats which are usually constructed out of materials including paper mache, metal, wood. They're decorated, and then they are used during Ashura processions, and usually they are created in the form of Ḥoseyn's tomb in Iraq. Right. A little bit on the history. Mourning rituals before the rise of Islam were common throughout the Middle East. And when I say mourning rituals here, I mean specifically mourning rituals for figures who are considered to be holy by one religion or one group or another. Some very notable figures are, of course, Tammuz, Adonis, Siavash, and of course Jesus, along with a variety of local figures. Several of these ritual ceremonies are discussed by Islamic historians and continued into the 13th century. So, for example, mourning rituals for Siavash continued probably at least until the 12th century. That's, I believe, the last specific mention I was able to find of these rituals still being performed in Central Asia. However, there is a much later mention of them by the 20th century Iranian novelist Sadiq Hedayat. He mentions that women were still mourning for Siavash into the 1950s in southwestern Iran. So the point of this is that there are certain typological similarities between these types of mourning rituals and mourning for Ḥoseyn. In particular, themes of duality between catastrophe and rebirth are extremely common. And as a caveat to this, so when I suggest a commonality of themes, I do not mean that Kāshefī intended to revive worship of Siavash or any non-Muslim divine figure under an Islamic cover. Rather, what I'm saying is that he employed memory relics in order to localize the Karbala narrative from Arabic literature. And doing so, he drew on a literary continuum which stretched back into the pre-Islamic past. And as another aside, the similarities between mourning rituals for Ḥoseyn and for Siavash in particular, and for those of you who don't know, Siavash is he is a legendary figure from the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, as the national epic of Iran. He was a king's son and possessed of divine favor from God, who was treacherously murdered. So, as an aside for this, it's important to note that this observation of similarity between Siavash and Ḥoseyn, the mourning rituals for them, this is not just something that I have noted. It is a comparison which has been going on throughout Iranian history. There are explicit comparisons between the two of them in Iranian languages going back as far as, I believe, the 14th century. Explicit comparisons. And several Iranian scholars have argued for similarities. Some have argued that these similarities are superficial, of course. But one important scholar, Ahsan Yarshater, specifically wrote an article which made this argument, which was a sort of a springboard for several of my points in a specific chapter of my dissertation. All right, but more specifically on the text itself, the Rowz ol-Shohadā, translated as the Meadow of the Martyrs. It is arguably, at least in my opinion, it is one of the most important and influential texts in the development of modern Twelver Shiite Ashura commemorations. And when I say this, it's important to note so that, like, basically, at the point when Kāshefī dies in 1504, this is basically when we mark conventionally the beginning of the early modern period of history, right? It was composed by Ḥoseyn Rowz Kāshefī, who, as I mentioned, died in 1504, and it was completed in 1502, so only 2 years before he died. It was dedicated and supposedly written for the Timurid ruler of Herat, who is Sultan Ḥoseyn Beyhaqī, who was noted to have, if not to be Shiite himself, to have strong Shiite sympathies, but it's generally thought that he was Shiite. It is important also as the earliest fully extant maqtal, martyrology or martyrdom narrative in Persian and composed specifically for Persian speakers. So we do have evidence that suggests there were earlier maqtals in Persian. There are notations made by people like Buzurg, I believe, mentions this, but also several other scholars have suggested that there were earlier texts. They do not survive, at least in any form that we have found today. Kāshefī also quotes poetry and bits and pieces from these other earlier maqtals, but there is no complete version of any of them that we are aware of. This text, the Rowz ol-Shohadā, was specifically designed to support commemoration rituals and particularly to elicit weeping from the audience. How do we know this? Basically, Kāshefī tells us explicitly the latter, that he wants to, use this text in order to make people cry. And he states that there is tremendous merit in crying for Ḥoseyn. This is an uncontroversial point because the statement that crying for Ḥoseyn provides enormous merit, savab, is quite old and goes back to at least the 10th century. The first point, however, is a little bit more reading between the lines, but we do have several sections throughout the text where Kāshefī says that he wants his audience to memorize and to recite the text during Ashura. He also says that it is recommended to create a majlis, a session, in order to recite texts, probably meaning his own text as well as other forms of poetry. As well as several other ritual recommendations throughout the text. This book became almost instantly popular. There are 5 Turkic translations following before even a century passed. So basically about halfway into the 16th century, there are already like 5 translations into Turkic languages. The earliest known one is the Shuhada Nameh, or Book of Martyrs, which was completed in 1539. This translation is particularly notable because it says in the text, it is in a form of Turkish, which is closely related to modern Azerbaijani, that it was ordered by the second Safavid Shah, Tahmasp, who died in 1576. So this is a basically proof that the Safavids were not only very aware of the text, but in fact were commissioning translations and probably having the text read in mosques during Ashura. Documentary evidence shows that the book was patronized by the Safavids directly and indirectly, and the ritualized recitation of the Rawzat became called Rawzat ol-Shohadā Khani, or chanting the Meadow of the Martyrs. It was later shortened to Rawzat Khani. Now, it was long suggested by scholars like Calmat, a French scholar who also wrote on this topic, that the term, the Persian term Rowz Khani was derived directly from the term Rowz ol-Shohadā Khani. However, there was no direct attestation that he could find that proved this connection. So it remained largely theoretical. However, I was able to find some inscriptions that are in a school in Esfahan, which specifically use the term Rowz ol-Shohadā Khani, and thus provide us with verification, direct textual verification of this transitional form. Another question that might be asked, well, maybe this was intended to refer to another text called the Rowz ol-Shohadā. This is extremely unlikely because we know of no other text titled the same in Persian that enjoyed anywhere near the comparative popularity of this text. So with the tiniest margin of error, it is almost certain that this term originally derives from the chanting of this text, the Rowz ol-Shohadā. Right, and this is a sample of Kāshefī's handwriting in the introduction from the Rowz ol-Shohadā, just to give you a sense of what his handwriting looked like. Commemorations for Ḥoseyn, so the rise of this specific form of mourning rituals and what came before. What makes this particular set of mourning rituals after the Rowz different from what came before? Because we do know certainly that there were mourning rituals for Ḥoseyn that, obviously predate the Rowz. So what's the difference? Well, commemorations for Ḥoseyn and the martyrs of Karbala started almost immediately after his death. Pilgrimage began to his tomb, mostly by a group called the Tawabun, those who were seeking like repentance or forgiveness, right? These are generally composed of the people of Kufa who had pledged their support to Ḥoseyn and then didn't show up at Karbala, a fact which many people felt tremendously guilty about. The pilgrimage started to his tomb. Keep in mind that only his body was buried there. Supposedly his head was taken back to Syria. In fact, the famous Al-Ḥoseyn Mosque in the center of modern-day Cairo is supposedly the place where Ḥoseyn's head was buried when the Fatimids were able to ransom it back from Syria. But his body is buried in Iraq, in Karbala. We know that the recitation of Marthiyya, or eulogy over his tomb, or eulogy, or more specifically, elegy, over his tomb became quite common. We have the attestation from the 10th century text, the Kamil Ziyarat, or the Complete Guide to Pilgrimages by Ibn Qulaway, who died in somewhere around 978 or 979, which is a textbook of the rituals surrounding the commemoration of Ḥoseyn. In one particular chapter, he notes that there is tremendous merit for those who recite poetry for Ḥoseyn, who weep and then cause others to weep. These rituals were sporadic, however. They received no official support, institutional support, except under a few Shiite dynasties such as the Buyids and the Fatimids. But they were not necessarily regular. They did not necessarily continue year after year. And we don't have the same attestation of specific sets of rituals that were performed, just that mourning took place and that there were majlis of some kind that took place. So the earliest truly organized commemorations, particularly commemorations where specifically dedicated texts were recited, take place in the 16th century under the Safavids. Possibly beginning under Shah Ismail, but we don't have a direct attestation for this. Possibly under Tahmasp, again, not direct attestation, but we do know that he ordered this text to be translated, but we do know that it was taking place under Shah Abbas. The earliest reference of official monetary support from a government for a specific set of rituals called Rowz Khani occurs in a list of expenses from the Shah Mosque of Esfahan in 1614 under the reign of the Safavid Shah Abbas. And now I want to talk a little bit more about the use of emotions. As I said, the use of emotions is central to this text. We find many forms of, usages of poetry, many usages of prose throughout the text, which is a mixture of both poetry and prose, mostly shorter poems, usually about like do beiti, 2-line poems, but occasionally much longer ones. Some examples: come and see, Ashura is today, the world is dark and lightless today. Ḥoseyn, who is the light of the Prophet's eye, today is overcome in the clutches of the enemy. With a cutthroat, dry lips, and heart's blood, today his head is cast far from his body. With a face like the sun, oh woe, today is veiled with a storm of swords. And then he goes on to give very detailed, very heartrending descriptions of what took place during the original Ashura. He also wanted to cultivate a meditative state wherein the listener, the audience, not only remembers Ḥoseyn, but is instructed to imagine they were fighting at Karbala alongside him. It is important to mention here that he does not instruct the listener to imagine as though they were Ḥoseyn. He does instruct them to try and feel his pain, but the idea of explicitly identifying the listener with Ḥoseyn is controversial and generally disavowed. But rather, it is strongly encouraged to imagine you are in his company. If you wish to dwell in the mansions of heaven, then cast your curses upon the murderers of Ḥoseyn. If you are happy with your fate, then remember the reward of those who became martyrs in service to Ḥoseyn. Whenever you remember the events of Karbala, meditate to yourself, would that I were present at that battlefield so that I could sacrifice my life for the unjustly treated king. I would have sacrificed my life for the right of God if I had been there at the time of Ḥoseyn. Another theme which is important is the theme of salvation. And here I must also note that the theme of salvation, while it might seem in translation to be overly evocative of Christianity, it is important to note that the mechanisms wherein salvation work in Kāshefī's lens and in later Iranian Shiite conception are markedly different from Christian concepts of salvation. Ḥoseyn did not die in order to redeem the entire world, right? An intercession that takes place, shafa'at, is accomplished through Ḥoseyn by the grace of God. It is not Ḥoseyn's power per se directly which grants salvation. It is through intercession. So the Rawzat and later works which built off it are explicit that weeping for Ḥoseyn and his family leads to salvation. We find this is one particularly evocative set of lines in the Rawzat. Beruz hashar bebini be dast peygamber kalid ganj shafa'at be khun bahayi Ḥoseyn. On the day of gathering, you will see through the power of the prophet. The key to the storehouse of intercession is through the blood price of Ḥoseyn. So through that weeping you performed today, tomorrow God will provide you with such merit that even the account keepers of the earth and the celestial spheres, i.e. the angels, could not tally up the total sum of his merit. And it goes on to say that basically Ḥoseyn will intercede for whoever cries over him and whoever mourns and weeps for him on the day of judgment in front of the divine court, and will grant salvation, najat, upon Ḥoseyn's mourners. If they shed tears and weeping for the martyrs through the king of the martyrs, God will absolve their sins. We see the same continuity, which is repeated in later Ta'ziyah Naamehs, i.e. the dramatic performances of Ta'ziyah. So this is one from the early 19th century. Ḥoseyn says to Imam Hassan, "May I be your sacrifice, O light of the Prophet's eye? Since you and I were born of one mother, why should becoming martyrs be a cause of disgrace and shame for us? Rather, it will be a cause of honor and esteem, because the salvation of the Shia is dependent on our martyrdom. Though this may not mollify us, our happiness is not important. What can be done? This is my compact with God most holy, that when the blood drips from my throat unto the dusty ground, through this cutting of my head, God will bestow mercy. Through us, he will absolve the sin of our Shia." Another important element is the great amount of concern that is placed over the weeping of Fatima, as well as the weeping of the female members of Ḥoseyn's family. Obviously, Fatima was no longer alive by the time that Ḥoseyn was killed. However, there is a long-standing tradition that she wept in heaven over his death. Fatima is repeatedly compared to Mary in the Rowz, which is a long-standing Shiite tradition which describes her as the greater Mary, al-Maryam al-Kubra, as angelic, Hawriya Insayeh, and virginal, Azra or Batul. One Shiite hadith claims that Jesus was born on the very spot that would become Ḥoseyn's tomb. This theme is reinforced by her divinely provided pre-knowledge of Ḥoseyn's death, which is delivered by Gabriel. So this is a reference from the Rowz. Basically, right after Ḥoseyn is born, Gabriel comes and announces to her that Ḥoseyn will die tragically long after she is gone. And she even says, "When this happens, neither you nor I nor ʿAlī nor his brother Hassan will be alive." And but that at that same time, a voice calls out, which is probably intended to be Gabriel, "Until the end of time, each year when the appointed season comes around, those who have suffered tragedy will hold his funerary ceremony in order to acknowledge him as a martyr. They will commemorate him anew and recount the circumstances of his tragedy, rain down tears of penitence from their eyes, and breathe deep burning sighs from their breasts." And then on that day, on the day of Ashura, the Rowz states that Fatima will weep with Houris in heaven, and that she continues to shed tears every Ashura over this event. And the evolution of a new ritual complex. So as I mentioned previously, there are recommendations set down throughout the text which strongly hint at specific set of organized practices which are supposed to be observed throughout the 10 days of Ashura. It's also notable that the text has 10 chapters. I believe, although I don't have explicit proof, but I believe that each one of these chapters was meant to be chanted on each day of Ashura. There's a hint from a European travelogue written in Latin, dated in the 18th century, which says that they read from a text called the Rowz, and that a chapter from this text was read each day. Now, I strongly believe the text that is mentioned in this Latin travelogue is the Rowz ol-Shohadā, but there's still a small amount of uncertainty. All right, we see several recommendations that there is a recounting of the events of Karbala, that people should cry, that they should make others cry, that a mourning session should be set up, and that the memory of the martyrs of Karbala should be dwelt upon and should be brought to life again. And just a little sense of what this looks like in the modern world. As I mentioned, I unfortunately, only having an American passport, I have not had the chance to go to Iran and see one of these, the Ashura, the death days, being performed live, or a Taziyah Nameh. I've had to settle for, watching them on YouTube and so on. But I did get a chance to see equivalent sites which are used for these purposes in Lucknow. So this is the Chota Imambarda in Lucknow, which was completed in 1832. And the interior shrine. So inside that shrine, you see tabut, or cenotaphs, which are built for Ḥoseyn or for members of his family. People will regularly come here, even outside of Ashura. They will weep. They will sing spontaneous songs to Ḥoseyn in memory of his death. You can see here one such model, a shabih, of his tomb, which is inside the Chota Imambarda. This is a plaque outside it, which gives salutations to Ḥoseyn, to the members of his family, and to the martyrs of Ashura. Right, and that's it for my presentation. I know I went a little bit long. A lot of stuff to try and cover, but I guess now we can set aside some time for questions.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Paul. It was a very great lecture. So everyone can unmute yourself and speak out your question, or you can also have written questions. I can read, whatever you prefer. So by the time people are thinking to have questions, I was thinking of because of the Deluge of Tears that you as your title, and also I think because you have Catholic background, there's a gift of tears, like in Catholicism.
Yes.
How central is crying or weeping in Catholicism, Catholic
So
Christianity?
it's not. It doesn't hold the exact same place. You're supposed to weep on Good Friday, and definitely in many places. In Spain, they used to have very complicated processions. I don't know if they still do them, which were conducted on Good Friday and throughout Holy Week, which do bear some similarity to Death Day. However, I am not specifically aware of a text of the same comparative importance that says if you weep over Christ's death, then that is the key to salvation. And Christianity, generally speaking, the key to salvation is belief in Christ as the Messiah, as the Son of God, and so on. And this is more ancillary, a part of popular religious practices. Yes, passion plays do have a part in Christianity, particularly during the medieval period. There were absolutely passion plays. And I remember growing up that on Good Friday, the priest and or really we should say the celebrant in this case, because it's not a mass. Mass does not take place on Good Friday. Will essentially act out a simplified scene of the events that took place on Good Friday leading up to Christ's crucifixion, with the audience participating. And this was something that was in the back of my head as I was writing the dissertation, That being said, the title of the dissertation is not influenced by that at all. It is actually, it is strongly inspired by the titles of many later maqtals in Persian. So you have, for example, there's a famous one called Tufan ol-Buka, the deluge of weeping. There's another one which is called the evoker of sorrows. There is Muthir al-Ahzan, which is again sort of the evoker of sorrows as well. Many texts have this structure as part of their title, and so this is what I was going for when I titled the dissertation, as well as what I was going for when I wrote my original Marthia. The title of my poem is Tufan ashk در میان فیضان رشک. Otherwise, the deluge of tears amongst the also sort of like the overflowing of rancor or rage.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's very interesting. Because you are studying right now Buddhism, like the Indian religions as well. I'm wondering, is among like other like major world religions and denominations, is like crying has any centrality in any denomination, world religion or like denomination of religion other than Shi'i Islam?
Yeah, I mean, weeping it's a very human thing, of course, to weep over the people that we've lost. You know, even to weep for sometimes people we don't know. I mean, think about how many people cry over the deaths of celebrities, of public figures, and so on. So the impulse,
rituals, religious value, as a ritual or religious value.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one of the earliest examples we have is from ancient Greece. So in ancient Greece, there was weeping that would take place for Persephone. So in sort of commemoration and solidarity with Demeter, who lost her daughter, the goddess Persephone, to the underworld. So this is one such example.
Siavash, Tammuz, Siavash.
All of these had.
How about the current time, or current time?
In our current time, so it does take place for certain sects of Hinduism. I'm less familiar with it. I just know that it will happen during some commemorations. It's not like as elaborate as this. I'm trying to think of some other examples. There's ritualized weeping in Judaism. For example, you will weep for, historical figures. There's a famous saying, let his memory be a blessing, which is very similar to expressions which are often prefixed after the name of holy figures in Islam. And of course, is the practice of sitting Shiva after someone dies. But this, to my knowledge, the Iranian complex and how it's spread throughout much of the other Shi'i world is one of the most elaborate mourning rituals that I know of.
Yeah, thank you so much. Also in India, apparently Hindus also participate in the.
They do. Yes, it's quite fascinating. And despite the current political tensions between Muslim and Hindu communities, we know quite clearly that this is mostly a modern event, because in some places there were Hindus who were instrumental in helping to set up some of the equivalents of the death stays, the processions, and they would participate in them. They would weep for Ḥoseyn. Yeah. I mean, even when I was in Lucknow, I saw Hindus coming out of the Imambardas. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, very interesting. So one other question. So Zainab, do you want to ask the question by yourself? You can.
That was really good. I really enjoyed your lectures. I had a question about the translation of the topic, the Meadow of the Martyrs, how you became to this, how you came to this topic, and what's actually make a difference with that Garden of Martyr. And since the Garden of Martyr has a connection to the Quranic verses, why you didn't choose that? I think maybe I feel there is a kind of better connection with the other translation.
So the reason why I chose Meadow was sort of as a, what do you call it? Sort of a compromise, more or less. The original sense of the term Rawda in Arabic is a plain. Any kind of a plain, kind of vaguely equivalent to like Maidan, right? But Maidan tends to have the sense of like, an area where people will gather together, often in a city, but yeah, anyway. So the original sense is something like plain. The sense of Rawda as garden, Rawza in Urdu, is a more modern sense of the term, which largely cropped up due to the association of Ḥoseyn and the Martyrs of Karbala with flowers, often flowers, young shoots that have been, cut down before their prime. Ḥoseyn is very often compared to flowers. He's compared to gardens. There's lots of floral terminology that is used not just in the Rowzat, but in many poetry and later literature. But more properly, if Kāshefī meant something like garden, he probably would have used something like Hadiqat ol-Shohadā, or Bustan, Golistan, something along those lines. On the other hand as well, I don't know the exact first sense where Rawda became specifically associated with tombs, which it is strongly associated with tombs, particularly in South Asia nowadays. But it had become associated with specific sites, probably before Kāshefī. So he most likely meant it in the same as having this dual sort of meaning, both referring to things that are growing and blooming, as well as a cemetery. So I was trying to capture both of those senses. Also note that the term Rawda in Arabic in earlier usage can also be a site of battle as well. So yeah.
Thank you so much. There is other questions. If anybody wants to, you can open the mic and ask your questions. There is one said that, is it true that there are some evidences in Bible about the Ashura? I think what I know what the question is about. There is some, there is a verse in I actually was looking at the question, finding that the actual verse, the Jeremiah 46:10. It talks about the great sacrifice near the Euphrates River. And some Shia Muslims connect that to, it's very vague, the context. Is it like something or like historical of the time, but some Shia Muslims tie that to there's another term in the Quran about the Zabh Azim as a replacement for Abraham's son in the Quran. So it's replaced with Zabh Azim. Maybe these two connections, the sacrifice and there, I don't know, what's your perspective?
It's possible. I mean, I'm not a biblical scholar, so I can't really speak authoritatively on this. I will say, however, that there are parallels, right? So the reference to the sacrifice of Ishmael or Isaac, depending upon, whether it's the Jewish tradition versus the Muslim tradition, is repeatedly referenced in the Rowz. So the line that I took talking about, how Ḥoseyn is the key to salvation and everything, this is in the context of the earlier part of the text where Kāshefī is giving a brief qisas al-anbiya, the stories of the prophets, and sort of connecting each one of them back to the narrative of Ḥoseyn, how they sort of prefigure Ḥoseyn. Just look at what Jeremiah 46:10, but that day belongs to the Lord. Yeah, the Lord Almighty, a day of vengeance, for vengeance on his foes. The sword will devour till it is satisfied, till it has quenched its thirst with blood. For the Lord Almighty will offer sacrifice in the land of the north by the river Euphrates. Yeah, which is, of course, quite close. It's Iraq, obviously. I'm hesitant about connecting it too literally. So even when I connect Ḥoseyn to Siavash, to Tammuz and these others, and to Jesus, in each case, I have specific textual evidence to back it up. So, for example, the connection to Tammuz, Kāshefī, we know that he read, for example, the author of the Filah al-Nabatiyya, the Nabatean agriculture by Ibn Wahshiyya. And in this text, Ibn Wahshiyya gives one of the most detailed descriptions of rituals to commemorate the martyrdom of Tammuz, right? So there is some strong connection there, along with the thematic connection. Again, also with Siavash, there is poetry from different groups in the 14th and 15th century, which says specifically that divine powers incarnated 3 times, once as Siavash, once as Ḥoseyn, once as John the Baptist, and once as Ḥoseyn, and each time were beheaded and had their heads put on a golden dish. So that is a direct thematic connection there. I'm a little bit hesitant to make this connection because I haven't seen this particular verse quoted specifically in Kāshefī, whereas the Shahnameh, where Siavash is mentioned, is directly quoted in the Rowz al-Shohadā.
Yep. Thank you so much. One question says, since clearly this book was written at Timurid time, did you encounter with any literature or any type of document from Timurid dynasty like this as a proof of Shi'i tendencies in pre-Safavid era? So like
this is a complicated question. So both yes and no. We are, for example, not really sure what Kāshefī was. The conventional wisdom is to say that he is Sunni, which is kind of like challenged by this text. He specifically refers to the different descendants of Ḥoseyn, members of the 12 imams, as being Amal, right? He specifically will use those terms. He will use several other terms which are Shi'i coded. On the other hand, there are some people who say that, well, I mean, he's strongly associated with Sunnis. So, for example, he knew Jami, the famous poet and Sufi. He knew Jami personally, and according to some accounts, married his daughter. Jami was notoriously anti-Shi'i. So there are a couple of possibilities. It's possible that he was practicing taqiyya. I think that's sort of unlikely. I think it's more likely that he was incredibly sympathetic to Shi'ism, because what we have to remember is that before the rise of the Safavids, and particularly before the enmity that emerges between the Sunni Ottoman Empire and the Shi'i Safavids, the boundary between Sunnism and Shi'ism was less strictly drawn. We find Sunnis openly, expressing sorrow over the death of Ḥoseyn, over the deaths of the Imams, all this kind of stuff. So the boundaries are more porous, and so it's complicated to say. In terms of specific rituals that were taking place during Kāshefī's time or before it, we don't have, at least not that I have found, and I searched like really hard. We don't have specific documentary evidence of like anything concrete besides that mourning took place, right? And that people recited poetry, as per what you already saw from texts like the Kamil Fizirat, right? So that tells us that people were mourning and they were reciting poetry. Saying processions were probably taking place. This is, I think this happened under the Fatimids. We have some accounts from the reign of the Buyids, some, shall we say, more vociferous Sunni clerics reacted with disgust when one of the Buyid sultans allowed people to mourn publicly in the streets of Baghdad during Ashura. So we have a few examples like this. The difference, however, is that the post-Kāshefī commemorations are much more organized. There are specific sets of rituals with specific names. There are dramatic performances that really have no comparison elsewhere in the Islamic world that take place. So this is without a doubt the most complex evolution of the rites that we see, and arguably some, not all, but some of the commemorations that take place in South Asia were probably influenced by the importation of Persian Shi'ism from Iran, probably through the medium of the Nawabs, right, who were originally Persian Shi'i nobility and ruled places like Lucknow for long periods of time. They were the ones who built the Imambardas in Lucknow. So,
cool. Yeah, thank you so much. I guess there's no more question at the time. I wish you can visit Iran sometime soon, and also especially seeing the Karbala itself. I guess you haven't been in Karbala too.
No, I haven't. ḥoseyn, yeah.
It would be a catching experience, I guess.
Yeah,
okay, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us to tonight's program. So I will stop the recording.